July 31, 1960, Congress, Arizona. A school teacher out on a hike in the desert makes a horrible discovery.
Anytime you deal with crimes against children, it always affects people in different ways. And I can imagine that walking on and finding a little girl buried in the middle of the desert by herself, I would imagine that was pretty traumatic for everybody on scene. Not just the fact that it's a human being, but the other fact that it is just a small child.
The little girl's remains are terribly decomposed. She cannot be identified.
She was in an advanced stage of decomposition. That was part of what made it difficult to identify her. And they made note of it, that she had her fingernails and toenails appeared to be recently painted.
This is the story of the murder of an unidentified child who is ultimately dubbed Little Miss Nobody. And for 60 years, her identity remains unknown, and the search to find it goes cold. But can a groundbreaking new tool called genetic genealogy give this little girl's name back to her? I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. July 31, 1960, the desert near Congress, Arizona. A school teacher from Vegas is out looking for rocks to decorate his garden when he suddenly makes a gruesome discovery he will never forget.
He came across two spots in that wash that looked like there had been some digging activity, but there was nothing in them. And then came upon her body, partially buried in the wash. He called to the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. So a Maricopa County Sheriff's deputy showed up and confirmed that this was human remains, and then also realized that it was in Yavapai County, called us, and so we had a deputy who lived down in that area at the time. He went out to the scene and started the investigation.
Police arrive at the crime scene. They begin to gather what little evidence they can find.
She was wearing like a brown and white button-up shirt with some red shorts, and she had some flip-flop sandals on that were appeared to be adult-sized sandals that had been, the backs of them had been cut off so they would fit her feet a little bit better. Yeah, it looked like her toenails and fingernails had been painted at one point in time. They had found like a knife close to the scene where she had been buried that had what they believed was like a red stain on it, what they thought was blood.
There were some tire tracks that they saw in the area. They took photographs of them, but there were no casts made of those. As far as the footprints, you know, when you get into those sandy areas, those footprints don't have a whole lot of detail to them. It's very difficult to compare a footprint in a sand wash to an actual shoe. It's even hard to tell the size with any specificity. That time of the year, we're in what we call monsoon season, so it's very warm. Down there in the desert, it's not uncommon to have temperatures over 110, 115 degrees. And then when you get the high humidity from the monsoons, all of those factors speed up the decomposition.
Detectives continue to scour the crime scene and wonder why this little girl was only partially buried, exposing her to the brutal elements.
Out here in the desert, especially at lower elevations, it's very hard to dig. There's a lot of rock in the soil's very dry. It's just not conducive for digging a hole. And so a lot of these people are under pressure, they're under stress, they want to get as far away from, you know, their victim as they can, as quickly as they can. And at some point they just abandon it, cover it up best they can, and leave.
At the time, people in nearby Prescott are horrified by the crime and sad, this child has no name. They take it upon themselves to create a name for her, Little Miss Nobody.
Little Miss Nobody was given her name by the community in Prescott because they felt horrible that this little girl was just going to be buried with no name and nobody there to even pay their respects. So the community rallied around to buy a headstone, and on the headstone they wrote Little Miss Nobody.
Between the pastor and one of the DJs on the radio station, they got the word out about Little Miss Nobody and rallied the community to donate funds to pay for a funeral, to have a funeral service. And they did that at one of the cemeteries here in town. There were about 75 people from what we gather in attendance there. There was a eulogy.
A tender little child murdered and left to decompose in the Arizona desert, and now unidentified. Clues are hard to come by. Next on Bloodline Detectives, investigators launch their search for the truth. July 31, 1960, the desert near Congress, Arizona. The unidentified body of a little girl is discovered, half buried in a shallow grave. The community mobilized to give this little girl a funeral. Her only name, Little Miss Nobody. Meanwhile, investigators wait for her autopsy report, hoping the coroner comes up with meaningful clues.
He came up with an age range that was about 3 or 4 years in range. Now we would be able to get far more specific. He also came up with a range in height that we would be very specific now, because she was intact, but back then we ended up with a range in height. Those estimations also created an issue with trying to get her identified.
Her hair did have like an auburn tint to it that was believed to possibly have been, tinted a different color from her original color. Her teeth were intact. They did have her teeth. They did look at that. It looked like she had been taken care of, but her hair color did appear to have been changed to try possibly to conceal her identity, I would imagine.
The coroner at the time didn't have the medical training that we would require now. The cause of death was undetermined. He couldn't come to an opinion on how she died.
They didn't find any fractured bones, no signs of real significant trauma. Found the knife, but they didn't find any punctures or stab marks in her. So it was difficult, I would imagine, to make that call, and that's why she was listed as her death was undetermined. They couldn't figure out exactly what she died from even to begin with. We don't know for sure if she was killed there at that scene at that moment, or if she had died prior to that and just buried there. And that's something that has never really been determined due to the fact that we don't know exactly what caused her death.
Most people go through their entire life without ever seeing a deceased person firsthand. We do that frequently in this line of work. That's one of the hardest things to do, is to deal with a child who's passed away, whether it's homicide or natural causes or accidental. It's incredibly challenging. To have removed her back in 1960 under those conditions, you're dealing with everything associated with decomposition. There's bacteria that causes odor. You're not just looking at this, but there's other senses that become involved, and so it's incredibly challenging.
It's 1960, and at that time, forensic science is in its infancy. Investigators have heard of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, but retrieving it from a victim to analyze it for evidence is out of reach.
lot of interviewing, a lot of talking to people, a lot of that old-fashioned police work that they just rely on reports from other agencies. A lot of that was just rely upon just going out and talking to people and interviewing and doing the best they can with what they had at the time.
Local police in Prescott, Arizona know they need help. They reach out to Yavapai County Sheriff.
So in 1960, I mean, they don't have internet, they don't have DNA like we have it now. They barely knew what DNA was, and they don't have the ways to communicate by computer or anything like that between state to state, agency to agency. So unless somebody's coming forward and saying, that is my daughter, they're kind of out of luck in terms of just trying to canvass the area, but that's totally a shot in the dark.
There were several other states who said, hey, we have a child who is missing, and because of that large age range estimation and the height estimation, there were a lot of kids that could be included in that. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office deputies and detectives at the time spent a lot of time driving around the western United States to go interview law enforcement in those communities who contacted us or we became aware of had missing kids.
They reached out all across the United States, sent out bulletins to different law enforcement agencies inquiring about missing girls that had been in other jurisdictions. There were several different leads that detectives with the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office looked into, but were never successful in finding any certain leads at that time.
The hard work by Yavapai sheriffs pays off. They learn of a little girl kidnapped across the Arizona state line in New Mexico. 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos disappears from Alamogordo, New Mexico, just 10 days before the body of little Miss Nobody is found.
My mom told me that she had a sister when she was 5 years old. A couple came and took her away. And so I started asking questions. I said, well, did they find her? What happened? Did the police come? So my mom said, yeah, the police came, the FBI got involved, the local Alamogordo Police Department got involved. They interviewed my grandmother, and during their interview, an investigation comes to find out Sharon was outside playing. My mom was in the front porch. Vicky was in the backyard playing with her and neighborhood friends, and they were playing in the back. And then the green car drove through the back alley. The lady in the car, it was being driven by a man, and actually shouted out the window, Sharon, do you want to come with us? We'll buy you new clothes and give you candy. And Sharon clung to Vicky and said, I don't want to go with you. And Vicky, being as old as she was, she said, I'll go with you if you buy me candy and clothes. And then so the lady got out of the car, grabbed Sharon by the arm, and pulled her, dragged her into the back seat of the car where there was 2 other kids, and then sped off. Well, instantly they ran to the front of the house where my mom was on the porch and said, somebody took Sharon, somebody took Sharon. And they started screaming, and my mom called for my grandmother, and they had to run to a neighbor's house because they didn't have a telephone in the home, and call the police. And so the police got there pretty quickly. They started doing what the police do even back then. They eventually called the FBI, and the sheriff had started setting up roadblocks and for a lookout for the green car. Then they started canvassing the neighborhood, and come to find out that this couple had been around for about 10 days asking questions specifically about my grandmother and about Sharon herself. Like, who's her mom? Is that Sharon? Does she have siblings? Is her mother, my grandmother, Lupe, is she married? All those type of questions. We found that very odd. I mean, nobody could explain it to us. My grandmother had no idea who would want to take her. So there was a lot of good evidence, visual evidence, but they could never catch them.
Yavapai Sheriff's investigators reach out to Alamogordo police. Alamogordo suggests the little girl found in the desert may actually be Sharon Lee Gallegos.
There was some sheriffs in Arizona that might have some information. So instead of sending my mom or my grandmother, they asked a neighbor, a good friend of my grandmother, to go. She said that the sheriffs had discovered a body in the desert of a young girl, but the young girl had dyed hair, painted fingernails, which is something that Sharon and my grandmother and my mom never did.
A friend of the Gallegos family travels to Yavapai County, Arizona to view the little girl's remains. She tells investigators the child's body in the morgue is not Sharon.
There were ink footprints taken from the feet of Little Miss Nobody that were compared to known footprints of Sharon Lee Gallegos, and the FBI compared those and ruled them out. Sharon Lee Gallegos was ruled out as being Little Miss Nobody.
From my preteens all the way to my teenage years and into my 20s, that was a talk. Anytime any kid would go missing, it didn't happen often, but sometimes kids go missing for a day and things like that, but then they'd bring up, oh, what about Sharon Gallegos? She went missing and nobody ever found her. And in our family, we always held out hope that she would actually walk in the door, or we would actually find her living her life. My grandmother, she would be sad and always say, I wish I knew what happened to my daughter. My mom would always say, I wish I knew what happened to my sister. My Uncle John never spoke about it at all. And, through the years, there'd be a sheriff call, or somebody would put the name, would actually eventually contacted us and said we put Sharon Lee Gallegos' name into a database of the missing children. And we always carried that hope as a kid. I always did, my siblings did, and my mom and dad, they truly thought that they would find her.
Anytime a lead would come in, they would most definitely follow it, but ultimately they didn't. It was never led anywhere, and it was probably a little bit frustrating, I would imagine. It was probably something that ultimately they all wanted to solve, but as time goes on, unfortunately the tips come in a little bit slower. There's not as many things to go on, and ultimately the case goes dry. And ultimately, after a few years later, it kind of got pushed, sadly as it is, kind of to the side. And because there weren't new leads, there weren't new things to do at that time, there wasn't the technology that we have, so it does kind of just get put on the back burner a little bit and kind of get pushed to the side because there ultimately isn't much to go on at that point.
Next on Bloodline Detectives, Yavapai County investigators get help to solve a 50-year-old cold case, the murder of a little girl. In 2014, Yavapai County, Arizona. Sheriff's investigator Tom Bolts and his team reopened the case of an unidentified little girl murdered in 1960, known only as Little Miss Nobody. Now, over 50 years later, investigator Tom Bolts hopes a highly sophisticated lab can somehow retrieve DNA from the child's body.
There wasn't a whole lot of knowledge passed down from the old paper reports. Most of the people who were working here in the 1960s had long since retired. Our cold case volunteer, Brendan, had attended a training and met another cold case volunteer from Colorado. Her name was Sylvia Pettum. And the two of them became acquainted, started talking. And Miss Pettum had asked about Little Miss Nobody because of some similarities between a case she was helping with in Colorado. Miss Pettum also had worked with the National Center for Missing Exploited Children, or NCMEC for short. She mentioned to Brendan that NCMEC may be willing to pay for the exhumation and examination of the remains of Little Miss Nobody.
It's a lot of paperwork that does have to be signed off by a Superior Court judge. All that paperwork was drafted. Ultimately, it was signed by a judge who did approve that, and the funds were raised. We got the money and we went to the local cemetery, and the process was started. But there does a lot of paperwork, a lot of stuff prior to that had to been done and approved, and it's just a process like everything, and it just takes time. And but ultimately, we got things together and got that approved, and we're able to do that.
There's emotions that you go through. You have a dead child, and probably a murdered child that was cast out and, to our knowledge at the time, not reported missing. You feel very sad for the child, but you feel hopeful at the same time for the child that you're going to be able to find out who she is and what happened to her and bring somebody to justice.
It is challenging and it is hard. Like I said, you're dealing with little kids and little girls, little human remains, but I think at the same time it is difficult, but at the same time there's that level of excitement. Like, this is a possibility, this is a possible way that we can find out who this girl is. So at the same time it is difficult, but on the other side, just that excitement of, this is possibly the way that we're going to find out who she is. I believe that it was probably something that they wanted to do. It was exciting. It was opening the doors to possibilities of finally figuring out who this little girl was.
The exhumation of Little Miss Nobody takes place 2014. The girl's skeleton remains are removed from her resting place where the community buried her 50 years before. Now, Yavapai County investigators hope to obtain enough DNA to make a match.
Worked closely with a lab in University of North Texas to try and determine cause of death and recover DNA that we would then be able to put into a CODIS, the Combined Offender Database, in hopes that maybe someone in her family had committed a crime and their DNA would be close enough and we'd be able to get her identified, or that police, wherever she was missing from, had taken DNA from a family member and put that in.
We submitted all of our prior DNA reports through the University of North Texas, everything that we'd done up to that point. They knew quite a bit about the background of the case. We did share quite a bit of that information with them, and they did have all the previous DNA reports at that time, so they did have a good understanding of what the case was. And I think that's why that kind of sparked their interest and their willingness to help us out with that case.
The University of North Texas was able to give us a much more precise age range for Little Miss Nobody and a very precise height for Little Miss Nobody. They estimated that she was probably most likely 4 years old and about 3.5 feet tall. They were unable to come up with any likely cause of death. They were able to get a DNA profile that they could enter into CODIS, but there were no hits on that. We were hopeful that we would get a name and a date of birth and a location and an exact cause of death, and we'd be able to use that information to determine exactly how this happened, who did it, and get them into court. We didn't get all of that. What we did get helped move us closer, but it didn't give us all the answers that we needed to pursue the case.
The CODIS National Database does not provide any DNA hits. The University of North Texas Center for Human Identification then creates a facial reconstruction of how Little Miss Nobody may have looked in life.
In 2015, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved, and they were able to take her teeth and what they did have of her remains and basically create an image of what they thought this little girl looked like. And when they did that, it changed the game with this case, so to speak, because now you had this picture of a little girl who looked so young and everybody wanted to figure out who she was. It's like anything else. When you see a picture of somebody you're talking about, you can put two and two together. Oh, this is who I'm talking to. This is who I'm relating to. This little girl is who everybody's rallying behind to try to figure out who she was and what happened to her. So I think it just gave the case even more emotion and urgency than it had before.
When we received the artist rendering, the sketch, we publicized that in hopes that somebody would see that that sketch, that picture, and call us and say, hey, I know who this is. But we never did get, anybody who knew exactly who it was or enough to move forward to identify her. So from the time we exhumed her until about 2021, the case had gone cold again because, again, we didn't have any reports. We had no idea who she was, and so there's really, nowhere to start until we got a phone call from Othram saying that they wanted to help.
Othram Laboratories, Houston, Texas, a world-renowned specialist in forensic genetic genealogy. Its team of scientists combine DNA recovery with family history. They use this information to crack seemingly impossible to crack cold cases.
There's so many cases out there of these unidentified children. It's terrible, and we want to help solve every single one of those. But the Little Miss Nobody case is just, an especially tragic and just very well known case. It's something that I think anyone that's interested or has read about, unidentified remains and Jane and John Does probably knows this case. And it goes all the way back to 1960. And they spent decades trying all sorts of different methods, lots of different techniques, and trying to figure out who she might be. And then I think what really got me interested in it was that, over 60 years have passed and there's just no identity for this girl. So when I heard about the case, the fact that they had already tried methods elsewhere, and they truly, in the truest sense of the word, exhausted all leads and possibilities, I felt like this was an important case for us to look at because I worried that if we did not take a look at it, there may be perhaps no answer for even longer or for possibly forever.
Can the scientists at Othram Labs finally provide a name for Little Miss Nobody? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. (2022) Yavapai County, Arizona. Investigators hoping scientists at Othram Labs can utilize DNA technology to identify a little girl found murdered out in the Arizona desert in 1960.
Othram is the first lab in the world that was purpose-built to use advanced genomics and apply it to intractable forensic evidence. What we do is when all these standard forensic methods fail and you come to a DNA dead end where you're not able to figure out any more clues about the DNA that was left at a crime scene, we come in and we create one of these high-performing DNA profiles that have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of markers and more information than any other DNA profile ever created using these advanced genomics methods. Our case manager, Michael Vogan, he actually had a relationship with law enforcement in Arizona and Yavapai. They asked Michael if we would take a look at the evidence, but told him that unfortunately there was no more budget for this case because they had already paid for advanced testing and it hadn't worked. And so Michael said, we would be very happy to do so.
Othram had told us that they would make an attempt to do an extraction. They would look at the existing DNA profile, and if they didn't think that they would be able to identify her, then there was no risk to us. But if they thought that they had enough DNA material to get her identified, then they would partner with us. DNA testing is very expensive. Our public affairs officers were thrilled to help and really did a phenomenal job of getting the word out. We were covered on every local news broadcast down in Phoenix, which is about an hour and a half south of here. It's our largest media market. And so because of that effort, we were able to raise those funds in a very short period of time. It was under 24 hours.
Our community is very caring and very giving. And when they said that they'd already received the money within 24 hours, the public here is very supportive of law enforcement. It was a story that had been out there. People were interested in it. And I believe that people, just in general, that people have good hearts and they wanted us solved just as much as we did.
We took the remains, we extracted DNA from the remains. After the extraction, we ran this inspection to make sure that we understood everything that was, all the different components that comprised that DNA, how degraded it was, whether it was a mixture or not, how contaminated it was, all these different components for DNA. And then we decided the best approach on how to sequence that and build a profile.
I was actually very pleased. It was certainly far from the worst thing we've worked with, and I was extremely optimistic we'd be able to build a profile. Once the QC was in, it was just really a matter of time from our perspective. And sure enough, when we built the DNA profile, it came out looking great. We did not see any of the challenges that other groups had faced. Everything looked wonderful, quality of the data was high, and we had plenty of these genetic markers with which to then go perform the genealogical search and the familial testing that was necessary to positively resolve this case.
Back in 1960, police considered Little Miss Nobody may have been 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos. Sharon disappeared in Alamogordo, New Mexico, just 10 days before Little Miss Nobody's body was found. Now, investigators again follow that lead. They reach out to the missing girl's family seeking a DNA sample. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. (2022), Yavapai County, Arizona. Investigators team up with forensic scientists to try and identify a little girl 60 years after she's found murdered in the desert. Their next move? To obtain DNA from a living relative that could be connected to this little child victim.
Throughout the years, we've had different people contact us. The police, the Alamogordo police, actually came to my mom and said, would you give us a DNA sample so that we can put it in the missing children database? And then they contacted me and asked if I could get my uncle to do that the next time he was here in the United States. And so I was able to make that happen. He went to San Padre Island, and the police there took a DNA sample from him and put it in the missing database.
One thing we wanted to really kind of consider is that, over the last 6 decades, there was a speculation that this unknown set of remains could have belonged to this little girl that had gone missing in New Mexico. And so that's something we wanted to confirm. And we had the benefit of a living relative of the girl that had vanished. And so we built a profile from his DNA. We built a profile from the DNA of the skeletal remains. And we did a comparison to determine if we could establish that there was a relationship. And what we found, which was even more exciting, is that there was a relationship. And so this information, together with the investigation and other details, enabled investigators to conclude that, in fact, this unidentified little girl was Sharon Gallegos. And although they had ruled out Sharon Gallegos as a possibility early on, as science caught up and improved, we were finally able to use the proper techniques to demonstrate that, in fact, it was this little girl.
When we got the call from Othram and they told us that they were convinced that Little Miss Nobody was actually Sharon Lee Gallegos from Alamogordo, New Mexico.
And the first reaction was, are you sure? And we said, yes, absolutely 100%. They said, but this name was ruled out multiple different ways, multiple different times in the beginning as a possibility to this case. This case didn't just solve the unknown identity of Little Miss Nobody. There was also the disappearance of the little girl from Alamogordo, New Mexico. Early on in the investigation, there was a thought that maybe the two cases were connected, and then that was ruled out. And so they were very surprised to hear the name, but they were also very excited because they knew that finally there were answers. Finally, there was a path to figuring out what happened to Little Miss Nobody, or Sharon Gallegos in this case.
Immediately after getting off the phone with Othram and making sure we understood exactly what they had been able to determine, we started to work with NCMEC to make contact with those remaining relatives so that we could arrange a meeting to explain to them what we had found out.
What they confirm is that Little Miss Nobody is in fact Little Miss Somebody. She's 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos, after all. Sharon, the young girl who disappeared from the neighboring state of New Mexico in 1960.
I was trying to keep it together and not burst out crying. My sister did start crying. My brother was speechless, and my uncle didn't say anything. They were like, oh my goodness. My aunt really in Germany was the one talking and saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe it after all these years. And I myself, I thought, I just didn't believe it was happening. But then I was like, okay, they found her. What happened? What do we do, And so they told us they were going to do a news conference, and they had invited us to be there. It's kind of amazing. I mean, this is a story I grew up with my entire life. And I had never given up hope that we would find her, and hopefully alive. But at the same time, we do know what happened to her now.
David and myself, Michael, we all went up to the press conference in Arizona, and we also met Little Miss Nobody's nephew. He was the family member that flew in for the press conference to speak on behalf of the family. And it was extremely touching because even though he was only the nephew, it was very obvious very early on in his talk in the press conference how affected he actually was by Sharon Gallegos being abducted. He said he grew up a very different life because, they were always afraid to let the children go outside and do normal things. She was abducted in the middle of the day, right there in the middle of a small town. There was obviously some premeditation, and a woman had approached her mom about a job. This is the same woman that was found or thought to be seen in the car that took her away. There were other children in the car that took her away that eyewitnesses saw, and there was a strange man. That is the last thing anyone knows about what happened to Sharon Gallegos, and how she ended up in Arizona is a complete unknown.
The Yavapai County Sheriff's Department is a great example to hopefully other sheriff's departments and police departments that this technology works. And if there are cases that are sitting dormant on a shelf where there is a girl or a boy or a mom or a daughter or a father who has no identity, that they could have an identity, and that hopefully they'll take this knowledge, take that case off the shelf and reopen it and try something new because it's obviously working.
It would have been very easy to just say, hey, it was a long time ago. We're not going to be able to do much with this. But being able to identify her, and we're still working the case. We very much want to find out who those people in the car were. We very much want to find out what they were doing in Alamogordo and why they came through Yavapai County and what happened to Sharon.
I am happy that we got closure. I wish my mom was alive, to have seen this, because it was really hard for her. It was really hard for her. And, she took that to her grave not knowing what happened to her sister. I was able to see footage of my mother having her DNA taken at the police station. And it just broke my heart when she was telling Detective Osquero that, about the story. She was telling the detective about the story and how she felt, and she wished she could have done something, and it just broke our heart to see our mom like that. So I actually visited the site this Easter. Me and my partner went out there, actually to the spot where they found her body, and it's just probably 50 feet away from the road. And ironically, we had passed by that spot 15 times in our lifetime, going to Las Vegas, Nevada from Alamogordo. And I left a memorial there for her, just for our family showing our respect if that's where they found her. If it wasn't for that teacher that stumbled upon her, we would have never known. It's just kind of sad that they left this little girl there. But at least we know now that this little girl is my aunt.
A so-called nobody finally becomes a somebody. A nameless child gets her name back, and with it, a portrait of her short but sweet life is uncovered. It's the kind of resolution genetic genealogy can give us. The more people whose DNA is in the national database, the more likely it is that victims like little Sharon Lee Gallegos can get their names back again, even after 60 long years. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.